Good morning and welcome to Jew in the City Speaks with your host, Allison Josephs, also known as Jew in the City. One of the best things about this podcast, and I would say also since launching the Hollywood Bureau that we did last year, is getting to meet some really great people. It's really exciting to read a book that moves you, that speaks to you, and then get to speak to the author who wrote it. And that is exactly what is happening today. Something similar happened with Dara Horn. She wrote People Love Dead Jews, and then I got to speak to her after that. And I would say kind of up there in terms of importance of books that have been written recently to talk about the state of anti-Semitism in the world today and how we need to discuss it is a book called Jews Don't Count, written by David Baddiel, who is a British comedian, screenwriter, and just talented fellow. And it is a pleasure to have David on my podcast today. So thanks so much for joining us, David.
Hi, Allison. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. And I would say, besides just your book, which is excellent and lays out so many things in such important ways, similar to Dara, like this language of just saying Jews don't count or people love dead Jews, in moments of frustration where I see, the double standard or can't understand why no one cares or is speaking up or how could there be so much progress except for the Jews, to have the phrase Jews don't count as a way to explain that, it feels like a certain amount of power, almost like I have language now to express the frustration I'm feeling. So before we talk about why you wrote the book, where did that phrase come, Jews don't count?
It's a really interesting point you make that my book and Dara's book have both got kind of negative titles, and that does say something about how there's a conversation at the moment about imaging the conversation around Jews and around how inclusion and representation doesn't include them, impacts negatively on Jews, that the only way to express that a lot of the time is by these kind of quite ironic, bad sounding titles that can lead to issues. Like, a few people have not understood the title of my book, the fact that it's essentially ironic, that it's modeling a progressive attitude towards Jews that I'm deconstructing, and have said, oh my God, what is that book and what's it doing on your coffee table? And is it basically a terrible, racist, anti-Semitic tract? Of course, it isn't that, but that's an interesting position that Jews have found themselves in. And so that phrase, I think I was using it on Twitter before I wrote the book. And it's been quite effective, I think. I mean, even before I think the book came out, a couple of times when there were very, very kind of clear examples of what the book's about, which is that within the progressive conversation, within the sort of very heightened conversation about inclusion and representation and defense that we've been having, everyone's been having over the last sort of 20 years, the Jews are low in that conversation, that there seems to be a very high tolerance for anti-Semitism in that conversation. There are a couple of examples of that happened in Britain, and I started using the phrase #Jews don't count, meaning they don't count as a proper minority, meaning they are not worthy of attention when something happens that, were it to happen to another minority, would cause outrage. And that kind of got taken up quite quickly, I noticed, by whatever you might call kind of Jewish Twitter or whatever. And so then when I was asked to write a book, which I was asked by the Times Literary Supplement to write an essay book of non-fiction about whatever I wanted, I thought, I'm going to call it that, and I'm going to write about this. I'm going to write about the leaving out of Jews from the sort of huge kind of generally really good correction that's gone on about how minorities are thought about.
So, I think, when we talk about, and I've at this point read kind of like all the major anti-Semitism books, Barry Weiss, Dara Horn, yours. And, I think everyone kind of examines anti-Semitism on the right, anti-Semitism on the left. We expect white supremacists to just be racist towards all minority groups. And so that's kind of the expected thing. It's the people that are supposed to be including and diverse, leaving the Jews out, that is hard to understand, hard to wrap your mind around. Now, it's interesting. One of the other things I want to say, besides like meeting great people doing this work now, I want to also point out, you're an atheist, I'm an Orthodox Jewish woman. There's a lot that we see eye to eye on in this issue. And I have to tell you, it really warms my heart to see unity among Jews who may, practice differently, believe differently, but find a common ground on standing up for our own dignity and safety. Because I think that we're strongest as a people when we do stick together and, stand up for each other's rights. So from my perspective, anti-Semitism is a spiritual disease. And so it's not supposed to make sense. So when I see, the world progressing and, doing equality for everyone but the Jews, in my mind, that almost like strengthens my faith. But I'm curious, as someone who is not a believer, how do you explain the exclusion of Jews in places that are literally inclusion spaces?
Well, it's actually my atheism. I've actually written a new book called The God Desire, which is about being a Jewish atheist. But my atheism is quite important, I think, in my argument in Jews Don't Count, because it allows me to make a very, very simple point, which is that anti-Semitism is racism. It's not religious intolerance. Obviously, there may be components historically of religious intolerance, but in the present moment, the important thing to recognize is that anti-Semitism is racism. And the way you can demonstrate this, I can demonstrate it, is I am fundamentalist atheist. I 100% do not believe in the existence of God, and that will get me no free passes out of Auschwitz. Not only the Nazis, I can promise you those guys with torches chanting the Jews will not replace us, they would not ask me if I kept kosher before setting light to my house. They're not interested in what elements of faith or tradition I might have. They're interested only in what they see as an element of blood, right? Which is why anti-Semitism is racism. It's an accident of birth that we all share, whether or not we believe in it. We are just, our parents or have made us Jewish, and as a result, we are hated by some people who think about that. Now, the reason why the left fail to recognize that sometimes is that I think that Jews present a complex type of vulnerability for the left, because that's what the left are looking for. They're looking for what's the vulnerable group that we can ally with. And Jews, of course, and this is a racist thing, but not often recognized as such, are the only minority group that are troped, that are stereotyped as being associated with power and richness. Like all other minority groups, really, and often in quite patronizing ways, not always true, but they are sort of associated with oppression. They're associated with the idea that this minority group is always punched down too. Mm. And yet anti-Semitism, because of the association of Jews with power and privilege and wealth, it can seem to the people being anti-Semitic they are punching up. Kanye West is perhaps a brilliant example. And yet when Kanye talks about, I know he's recently rescinded, but let's forget his absurd rescinding for the moment about
But it'll change next week.
Yeah, I'll change next week. All the other stuff he said is all about they control me, they keep me down, I'm not allowed to say this, blah, blah, blah. And what that means is that he's talking about this ultra-powerful, in his mind, group of people who somehow or other, control the discourse and control the money and et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I think the left get, if you like, confused. Because I think they find it hard to imagine Jews as a vulnerable community. And what's weird about that is, of course, and, it's slightly different in America, I think, because in Europe, people like me, are very close to genocide. My mother was born in Nazi Germany, not my great-great-great-grandmother. My mother was born in Nazi Germany. Most of my family was murdered. And thus, the notion that Jews are somehow powerful and not a vulnerable community is really absurd, because of the nearness of that. And yet that's quickly kind of forgotten by people who say, well, the Jews are fine. They're fine, they're rich, they control stuff. We don't have to really bother about allying with them, even as we see, hate crime against Jews going up and conspiracy theory on the internet marking Jews down as somehow controlling and being behind the world's evil going up and up and up. It's a dangerous time for Jews, and yet the historical loop that leads to that is very quickly forgotten.
Totally. You bring out some points that are just, the book is so incredible, and everyone should go out and get a copy of it. There are some issues that you confront that I didn't always have an answer to. Number one, you state that I believe it's the median income of Indian Americans is higher than Jewish Americans. Did I get that statistic correct?
No, I think I'd say, it's based on data that it's probably already out of date because the book's 2 years old. But I just always said the issue with money, right, is like, as far as I'm concerned, it's not that important anyway, because right. I'm happy to say my grandparents were wealthy in Germany. Right. They had a brick factory, but, within a year, of Hitler coming to power that had gone, and within 5 years they were running for their lives, and most of their family had been killed. So, number one.
Well, my other point, my second point is that just because you have money now doesn't mean you can't lose it. And we have to sort of state, I think that's sort of a question that a lot of Jews don't know how to answer for themselves. If they are currently in a situation where they are more financially stable or secure, that might feel like something invincible to the outside world. But you have to just look back at not so distant history to see how.
Well, I think it's very important just to say out loud. I mean, can I swear on this podcast?
Sure. How? Yeah.
Not you.
Yeah.
No, I don't. But I say in the book, it's one of the times I kind of get angry. The book is, I think, mainly written in kind of sorrow and irony rather than anger. But I do say, fuck off about money, by which I mean stop deciding that because in your mind, this progressive mind, Jews are kind of wealthy, that therefore they are invulnerable, and particularly invulnerable to racism, because the history of Jews shows that constantly whatever wealth they may have accrued is taken away from them, and violently taken away from them. And also, it doesn't apply to any other minority. So to come back what you were saying, I saw one statistic, which I hope is correct, that globally, the religious group that has the most millionaires is Hindu, right? And no one would say, I really hope they wouldn't say, therefore Hindus are associated with money, and at some point we can like get envious about that and smash the doors down of the Hindu houses and take their money away. Because that's the point, by the way, about the whole money thing. A lot of people don't, like Joe Rogan, as you'll know, about a month ago, he said, of course Jews are into money. Saying Jews are into money is like saying Italians are into pizza. Now, the problem with that is history, because Italians have never been genocided because they like pepperoni on dough, right? But Jews throughout history have been exiled, discriminated against, and murdered because people think they control money. And that's an unbelievably important distinction that is somehow not made when people think it's just true that Jews are kind of, into money.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from the book?
Mainly good, actually. I mean, obviously some horrific stuff. Obviously, we live on the internet, and on the internet I get trolled and I get, horrific, anger and rage. And it's actually one of the things that you'll know as well, which is standing up for Jewish things, for Jews, on the internet gets a particular type of aggressive pushback. I mean, obviously all minorities may get this, standing up for yourself, but a particular type of rage comes with you saying, actually, I think this is anti-Semitic, because it's a sense in which that, like, at times it feels like you don't have the right to say this because Jews are so okay that we can't allow Jews to say this. It's taking away the airspace from other minorities, and I don't believe that at all, because I think there should be a limitless space to talk about discrimination and racism and whatever. So I get a bit of that. But on the whole, I mean, there's loads of Jews here in this country and now in America and a few other places where it's come out, have said this thing that you've kind of said, which is, there was a kind of thing that we couldn't articulate, particularly around like what progressive spaces were saying or not saying about Jews. And you have sort of articulated, Sarah Silverman in the documentary that I made about it, which was out on Channel 4 in Britain, said, she used the slightly unfortunate phrase and then made a joke about it, which is very Sarah, saying it was like a gas in the air, and you kind of made it solid. You sort of said, this is what it is. So I got that. Or almost more satisfying than that is some progressive people, it has kind of changed their mind. So I had one guy who wrote to me on Twitter who said, I realize something now, which I hadn't realized before, which is that anti-Semitism is the racism that slips past you. And I think that's true. I think, to be fair to the various good people who may have been neglecting anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is a more complex form of racism and discrimination than maybe other types. It is maybe harder to see how it's working. It's harder maybe for some people to understand how associating Jews with money is not a compliment, but a very dangerous thing to do. And so I guess if my book is a primer to like, here's how to spot when you are being unconsciously anti-Semitic maybe, then that's good if that's happening. So on the whole, it's been, I think it's helped to shift the dial a bit on the conversation.
So I want to talk about two things that, stuck out for me. And even when we first connected, you knew that Israel was going to be one thing. You kind of guessed that for me. So not an Neturei to kind of Orthodox Jew. The other thing that I wanted to clarify was, is one word that you use to describe the Talmud, which it's so interesting because obviously words have different meanings, like, first of all, in different contexts, even like different definitions of the same word. but certainly in the US versus the UK, words have different meanings. And I remember when I read, you were just sort of quoting the Talmud just in passing about something, and you used the word archaic. And I saw that and I was like, oh my goodness, this is a book about, fighting anti-Semitism. And here, this Jewish man is calling our laws outdated, with sort of a negative connotation to it. When I asked you about this, you explained that in the UK, the word archaic simply means old, correct?
Yeah, well, I think it also means that in America as well. I mean, in context, obviously, archaic can be something negative if you're talking about something that is purely contemporary, right? So if you're talking about a pop song and you say, oh, it's archaic, meaning it's out of date, then that's, I guess, a negative thing. But I'm talking about something that was codified many, many years ago, the Talmud. And I'm therefore, in Britain, I don't think there's anything wrong in saying that the rules and regulations that are being discussed in the Talmud are archaic. They come from a very long time ago. And in fact, that's part of its power, in my opinion. But I mean, I'm talking about it.
Right. I just, in case anyone noticed this and thought there was like any sort of judgment, like sort of laid over it, I did look at a UK dictionary definition and a US one. And for us, maybe we just don't like older things in the US because we're a newer country and you have a respect for the old. But I was really happy that I clarified that point because, and something we've discussed too, is sometimes there is a judgment from one type of Jew to another, obviously in every direction. But, something that I think you're aware of as well is that there can be this internalized hatred that Jews carry, where if someone is a more kind of outwardly observing or, seen to be a Jewish type of person, there can be a negativity there where they would rather a Jew be less Jewish. Anything you want to say sort of on
that's interesting. That's really interesting, Allison, because actually I'm very, very against that, even though I'm an atheist. So what I didn't really mention this when you were asking about the book, but one thing that the book really brought out was how much Jewish shame exists. So lots and lots of Jewish people, both young and old, have written to me to say they are ashamed about being Jewish. They don't tell people they're Jewish. They don't wear any outer symbols of being Jewish. I mean, I'm not wearing it now, but I wear a Makom David from time to time, not because I'm religious, but because I am militantly unashamed about being Jewish. But lots of people do carry this weird internalized shame about being Jewish, but it's really complicated because I think that when I see very, very religious Jews, what I think is that I have no connection to them sort of spiritually. I don't, but I do have a cultural connection to them. And so what people, again, don't understand is that when those people are under threat, which they are, or indeed when 11 Jews are massacred in Pittsburgh in 2018 at a synagogue, that is, again, nothing to do with religion. The people attacking them are attacking them because they're visibly Jewish, right? And they could be wearing no religious symbols, but just carrying a thing that says, I'm Jewish, really. That's why they're attacking them. And again, it's very important people understand that. That's a racist attack, even if it happens to a religiously dressed person.
Which is a good segue to my other question, which is sort of the last controversial piece, and we obviously have to touch at the Israel part of your book. So I would say, you say that you don't feel any connection to Israel, as a country. And I mean, even for someone like me who is a Zionist, I'm totally not connected to the politics of Israel. To be honest, I can't even figure out what is going on. I really keep trying to get the updates about what's going on. Even
it's quite hard at the moment.
Yeah,
I agree. I don't really understand what's going on at the moment.
But there's still they are our kin by blood. I remember the first time that I went to Israel, and growing up as the only Jewish girl in my public school grade, to be there and to know that the taxi driver and the waiter and just kind of everyone around was somehow distantly related to me. And I was not religious when I went there either, but I felt I'm somehow with extended family. So in your book, you say that sort of Israel is a non-issue. But is there nothing that you feel?
I mean, let me explain certain things there. So the number one reason I say that is sort of intellectual, actually, rather than emotional. I do feel nothing like the connection that some Jews feel towards Israel emotionally. That is just true. Okay. I feel much more connected to British and American Jews than I do to Israeli Jews who feel like foreigners to me, right? And it's quite important to say that in a way, because all other minorities who have many countries that might be connected to them religiously are allowed to say, British Egyptian guy or a British Muslim who lives in Britain is allowed to say these are foreign countries. And when I'm talking about Islamophobia, which they might want to talk about, I don't have to spend all my time explaining that I'm not connected to what's going on in Iran or what's going on in Saudi Arabia. But Jews have this weird thing because there's only one country, that there's this immense focus on it. And I have noticed, of course, and you'll know the book mentions this, that if I want to talk about anti-Semitism, the left continue to come up with this "what about Israel" thing. You know, you first got to put your cards on the table and denounce Israel. And I just say, look, I've got no connection with that country, or no more connection with that country than a British Muslim might have with the various countries that are Muslim, or, you know, in the Middle East or whatever. Why do I have to sort of disentangle it first? And that's my main point. But it is also kind of true. It's kind of true that, I mean, as I watch it now happening, I think, I don't know what's going on. It's kind of crazy. And I don't really feel massively like I need to get involved with it. I mean, this is on both sides of the spectrum, by the way. There's like,
let's say a Jew is killed. Let's say a Jew is killed in Israel. Do you feel that at like, yeah? Did you feel that at the action? I'm saying, let's say you see like a child has been run over by a terrorist.
That depends on the context, right? So if there's a straightforwardly anti-Semitic attack anywhere in the world, and that, by the way, is happening in Paris, it's happening in America, it's happening in London. Yeah, you know, everything I talk about relates to that. In Israel, it might relate to that, or it might be it's an IDF soldier in a kind of war situation, in which case it relates to it less, to be honest with you, because that's a kind of geopolitical situation that I think isn't that much to do with what I'm talking about, which is a particular type of, you know, way of thinking about Jews that allows them to be attacked by anti-Semites. So I don't necessarily, but I will, if I see what I consider to be, you know, it's complicated because I think there's unquestionably the case that types of anti-Zionism spill over into anti-Semitism. Not all of it, but some of it clearly does. I have a particular trick, if you want to know, how I disentangle it, and I say, look for the ancient trope. So, for example, and this is in the American edition of the book, it's not in the British edition of the book, because I wrote the American edition later. There was a rally in Hyde Park in London in support of Palestinians in, I think, 2021, and someone was carrying a placard with a picture of Jesus on it, on the cross, and it said, "Don't let them do it again." And that is clearly anti-Semitic. It's clearly anti-Semitic because, you know, the state of Israel, as we understand it today, did not exist in AD 33, and they were not cheering for Barabbas, right? So that means Jews. When that phrase, "don't let them do it again," it means Jews. And that happens all the time. And that I am totally, you know, on team, let's call this out. Right? Because it's clear to me that that's anti-Semitism.
By the way, I think that that's a brilliant, you know, sort of litmus test. I would add to it that, you know, Israelis being described as bloodthirsty baby killers harkens back to blood libels and And so what was interesting is that there was this like national like hate a Jew day a few weeks ago in the U.S. I'm not sure if you caught that. It was sort of like they're not even protesting a certain political position, just the fact that like we're still here. And thankfully, nothing happened over that. You know, it happened to be a Shabbat when it was called for. But then a few hours later, there was like a couple of Jewish kids that were just like run over in Israel. And it was like, okay, so the white supremacist angle didn't like, you know, kill any Jews on National Hate a Jew Day in the U.S. But a few hours later, kids just walking on the street. And again, I'm not trying to simplify complicated geopolitics, but also they were just children that were killed for the crime of Jews.
Well, obviously that's terrible. I mean, actually, just as a sidebar, I saw that was happening, and I did one tweet about it, but I was also quite keen not to amplify it because it also felt to me like that Hate a Jew Day. I didn't know that it was really a thing. It felt to me like if we give this too much air, then someone will get hurt. Whereas it kind of maybe it's just 3 or 4 crazy far right idiots trying to start something that isn't real, and that is what it turned out, right? So we need to be careful about that because I think it's a very real thing, anti-Semitism, and the dance that is happening is the far right are increasing and they're continuing to hate, and the left are being negligent. The sanctuary that we might feel is on the progressive left isn't really there for us. So we need to be careful within that exactly what's going on and how we point to something. And sometimes it's clear something terrible is happening towards Jews on the far right, like when Jews get massacred. and sometimes it's clear the left don't care. And that's what we need to keep pointing to. But I felt that particular Hate Jude was kind of like, yeah, these are just some crazies and we shouldn't give it the time of day.
I hear you. No, and thankfully it amounts to nothing. We got about 3 minutes left. Want to try to like wrap up with some final thoughts here. You know, it's one thing if Jews are not, you know, kind of included in like sensitivity trainings, and then there's a microaggression at work and no one's aware of it. You know, an article that we both saw recently, you posted about it, is this idea of the vanishing Jew, of Jews sort of, we had too big of a slice, we took too much, and now we have to kind of be decreased and cut down to size. The more that I learn about pre-war Germany, this trend is actually terrifying to me. And this time it feels like it's being done as a mitzvah because inclusion and diversity is great. We can all agree to that. But the exclusion of like a group that's been excluded for being a minority and other times now being excluded for not being a minority. Any sort of thoughts on that state?
Yeah, well, the key element of it is the over-representation of Jews in various places is kind of a myth, because it's all about like noticing. Like the noticing is kind of like, well, what are you noticing here? When Dave Chappelle says, like, you know, oh, there's really a lot of them. Well, you've gone to Hollywood and you've seen 1 or 2 Jewish names, and that's enough for you to think that they are controlling, you know. And I'm like, you know, we shouldn't always go to Germany, not for an example, but I'm going to go, which is that in the 30s, or in the 20s, I believe, in the 20s, Germans, ordinary Germans, thought that Jews completely controlled banking. They thought that Jews were completely in control of banking. The actual statistics were that there were 1 to 2% of Jews in banking in Germany in the 1920s. What they will have been is noticed by the few people who like want to notice that stuff, and then it will be spread that there are many Jews involved in banking, and people want to believe that. They want to believe that. And then what the progressive left tend to do when they're correcting, which they are doing, and some of that correction is good, but Jews get folded into whiteness. That's what happens. Is so when people say, oh, you know, we need more diverse faces. Yeah, we do, but Jews are diverse, and that's not recognized. So, you know, I wrote this article about the terrible Netflix film You People. What you notice in You People is that, which is about, a black woman and a Jewish guy getting together, is that all the trouble about that, it's all about Jews being white and rich. And the fact that the Eddie Murphy, the black guy, is anti-Semitic is kind of not a problem in that movie. And the apologies happen at the end of it. It's just the Jewish people apologizing for being white and rich. And he just has to apologize for not recognizing what a nice guy Jonah Hill was, right? And that's because there is this constant assumption that Jews basically can represent white people. I mean, I use this phrase in the book, Schrodinger's white. So without getting into the physics of that into complicated a way, what I mean is that Jews are white or non-white, depending on the politics of the observer. The far right have always thought that Jews were non-white. The left now sometimes seem to see Jews as kind of super white. And that is a real problem, and that's what leads to this erasure that you're talking about.
Fascinating stuff, brilliantly argued. Jews Don't Count by David Baddiel. Thank you for...
I have to say it's Baddiel. Allison.
Baddiel. Oh, sorry, Baddiel. David Baddiel. Sorry, it's my American accent. I was watching everything. Baddiel. David Baddiel. There we go. Okay, I've been just saying it wrong in my head. David Baddiel. It's not just that it's argued cogently. It's that you have the moral courage to say it. And there's no form of being intellectual smart that gives someone courage. That's just something that you have to have within. So thank you for being a strong advocate for our people. We wish you continued success in continuing to use your strong and proud voice to stand up for Jews everywhere.
Thank you. And same to you, Allison. Same to you for what you're doing with Jew in the City. It's great, and you yourself have enormous moral courage.
Thank you so much. Be well, and thank you so much for watching. You can catch us same time, same place next week. Bye-bye.